Okay, let me start. Let me start first of all by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Wurundjeri people, Kulin Nations. This is unceded land, which is really important. We're talking about migration, but of course, Australia is a nation of migrants, apart from First Nation Australians, and we haven't really dealt with that very well at all. That's not a long story, but it's important to acknowledge that. We're talking about. I went to a long introduction because we want to get straight into the discussion, but. We have Professor Lori Beaman here and Professor Serena Hussain, and we're talking about a project that we're doing with Fethi on migration, but I'm just trying to think, yes, I may know the answer to this, but some of us are old enough to remember when you travelled, like if you were doing field work, you had to make a long distance phone call on a landline, and connectivity was slow. I remember actually years ago, we were send letters on those aerogram things. But nowadays, of course, when you move anywhere in the world, you're connected by your phone and smart devices, and so the sense of connectivity is transformed in good ways and bad ways. It means troubles of one part of the world follow you where you are, and you watch video feeds live. So I imagine that is one of the aspects we're getting into with this project. It's an old question, but it's looking at it in the context of current circumstances and technology. So I won't say more, get into it. Thank you.
So I need the laptop, Greg. Thank you so much. Can do through that laptop. Thank you, Greg, and like you, of course, like to acknowledge that wherever we are meeting from, all of us are meeting from unceded lands of the Indigenous people, and we are joining you from both, of course, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we pay our respects to the leaders, past and present. So I will jump straight into it, as Greg said. So this is basically an ARC discovery project which has come to an end, extended and come to an end late last year. And so now we are in the final stages of trying to disseminate and publish as much as we could. I'm very pleased to have my partner investigators from the UK, Serena Hussain, and from Canada, Lori Beaman, who because the project is comparative in many aspects, and so they really helped a lot with the sites that we looked at in those two jurisdictions, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the project team is much larger, and I always like to make sure that everyone is acknowledged. So in addition to the CI and the PIs, we had a large research team. Two of those research fellows had left. One succeeded the other, but both of them left, and many field work and local RAs who did a fantastic job helping us to conduct the interviews in particular. Background, Greg already jumped into, like he laid the ground for the background. So before I do this, the structure of this presentation is slightly unusual. So it's a kind of a panel, but I will present, and then Lori and Serena will respond or add some comments by way of further discussion or analysis. So that's how it will be. So, and I won't read everything in the slides, just really for you to look at, but I will speak to them in a very, hopefully, succinct manner. So there's no doubt about that we are experiencing a kind of hypermobile world, and this hypermobility, which is a key aspect of kind of globalizing process now, many processes that are going on. They reflect what's going on around ICT, information technologies. They reflect what's going on in terms of transportation. And of course, transportation means we are compressing in a temporal-spatial manner all sorts of configurations and manifestations of our relational world. Yeah? So the way we relate is changing. And that compression of the what I call spatial temporal dimensions of our engagements are really impacting many things that we do in our lives. And migrant youth in particular are shaped by these processes because there's a strong relational dimension to their practices. They often forge these practices across borders, not within particular jurisdictions. And therefore, we cannot really make sense of how they operate, how they engage, how they build relations if we don't look at cross-border relational engagements. So yeah, this is why I think this project was specifically designed and framed, so to understand some of those relational / transnational practices. But I'll come to how it's been framed, yeah? The focus on migrant youth really puts the emphasis on identity in particular, yeah? How we understand identity among migrants youth, and why identity has become an extremely salient feature in contemporary discourses, yeah? Migrant youth, they have, perhaps very differently from their parents, they engage or they're exposed to both inter and intra-cultural dynamics, yeah? So parents usually, they focus on the ethnic cultural community. Migrant youth interact within those communities, so that's the intra, but also they engage in strong inter-community relations. So we call it cross-cultural networking, but this is another way of framing it, yeah. The main thing in this project, though, is really the emphasis on the individualistic nature of those articulations of identity, as opposed to what we've seen for many decades, kind of homogenized and reductionist approach to the notion of common culture. Now, that is potentially normatively a problem for multiculturalism, because multiculturalism has always really argued for space for collective claims of cultural rights. In this particular project, that is not really our emphasis. Our emphasis is on the individual young person who happens to be a first or second generation migrant, and how they really engage in an ongoing process of not only formal but re-evaluating a lot of those dynamic aspects of cultural identity. So that's the second point. The third point is, of course, in relation to what I call pro-diversity management policies. And in Australia, we have a very kind of a dominant multicultural approach. And now we have been supporting it through other interventions, in particular intercultural interventions in local governments. But in Europe, the intercultural approach has really been much more dominant now, in particular in kind of continental Europe, but also partly in the UK, following the Cantor Social Cohesion Report of 2002. The main thing to emphasize here is what do various diversity governance models, what do they generate in relation to the everyday lived experience of migrants in relation to respect, recognition, inclusion, etc. How do they really impact, if at all, those experiences of migrants? So the theoretical context, therefore, I'm just summarizing it here. That increased interconnectivity that Greg mentioned earlier, the compressed temporal-spatial articulations, which are extremely important, and then the superdiversity and, by consequence, the intersectional nature of our identities. So if you look at those three things, growing interconnectivity, temporal-spatial compressions, and intersecting identities in superdiversity contexts, then you get really the gist of the theoretical framing of what this project is trying to do. But it's trying to do that in relation to intergenerational relations within and across borders, and also in terms of how all of that affects identity. I call it strategic emotional, strategic as in how you choose to project your identity in different milieus, social milieus, and emotional, how it really feels to you to say, I'm hyphenated, I'm not hyphenated, I'm predominantly Aussie, predominantly whatever you are, yeah? And then what the implications of those for citizenship. Just going a little bit further with the context and the theoretical framing. So against that kind of theoretical framing, what we need also to emphasize is that there are a number of phenomena which are dominating our socio-political landscape, if I can put it like that. First one is we are seeing what I call muscular discourse around social cohesion, neo-assimilationist in many ways. This really has started in, with the so-called failure of multiculturalism. We've heard European leaders in particular, proclaim multiculturalism as a failure, utter failure in some cases. We've seen the various reports in the UK. Most infamous one, of course, is the Cantor Social Cohesion Report. Those things have cascaded, if you like, into a backlash against pro-diversity migration policies. We've seen public institutional kind of approaches trying to discipline all signs of non-conformity. divergence, of diversity. And all of that, of course, has been further exacerbated by hyper-securitized agendas in the West in particular. We started seeing language like least desirable and, problems, etc., etc. All of this really raised questions in relation to what is meant by integration, adaptation, assimilation, among other concepts. So what we really wanted to understand here is that process of cultural adaptation or acculturation, which of course characterized by kind of a hybrid, fluid, etc. identity. It's also a negotiation of a lot of tensions, in many cases dual tensions, but could be multiple tensions, which is arising from a desire to change, but also to adapt. So what kind of balance do you maintain as you integrate into your new post-migration setting, but you also carry what I call the heritage, linguistic, cultural, religious, many types of heritage. And the adoption of hybrid identity, therefore, constitutes one of the main strategies to cope with political shifts and entanglements of social organization and everyday cultural practice. The key to all of these kind of questions around hybridity and around managing those tensions is where does citizenship come into all of this? Does it have an equalizing role? Does it have a heuristic role? Does it allow, does it facilitate people to feel like they belong into those political communities? Citizenship is really interesting. I don't really, I'm not framing this particular discussion in citizenship terms, but it's very important for us to spend a few moments thinking about it, So we're not talking here about the legal status, by the way. We're talking about the multi-layered, affective, performative dimension of citizenship. So forget the normative approaches to it for a minute. I'm focusing specifically on what is known as active citizenship. It's the capacity to perform acts or deeds as part of your citizenship. Therefore, you move from being passive subject to becoming active agent in that space, Many colleagues, and some of their colleagues actually are our colleagues who work with us here and then moved on, like Brian Turner, but others have even developed it further into performative acts of citizenship. Turner and Eisen work in particular is very important here. So the ethos of active citizenship is located in the values of democratic self-determination, reciprocity, and solidarity. And this project actually is about those things. To what extent you engage in reciprocal acts of relational engagement? How do you maintain and how do you build solidarity ties locally and transnationally? Right? But the performative framing of citizenship, as opposed to what has become known in the literature as contributory citizenship, that is like you have rights and you have duties. As a citizen, your rights are A, B, C, D, but you have to perform certain duties. So moving away from that one and focusing on the performative opens possibilities for the multi, for the inter, and for the trans cultural being. So that is very, very important. But as you perform your citizenship and you don't reduce it to a set of duties and rights, then you open up the space for that multi-level, let's say, multi-layered notion of cultural being. And that is the latter. So that latter concept, or the latter framing of citizenship, is what points us towards TC. TC is transcultural capital, which is the framing of this project, right? So that opens up the possibility of framing what migrant youth do as building transcultural capital. So that is transcultural capital now, is the theoretical framework for the project. So it is all about, how migrant youth foster multiple ways of being and belonging, make sense of their identity in relation to connectivity and transnational mobility. It emphasizes a non-linear cross-cultural phenomenon that generates new forms of cultural being. So it's not additive in many ways. It's certainly not substitutive, but what it does, it allows new forms of cultural being. So it deals with human interconnectivity and focuses on the selective weaving of various cultural elements to create that new cultural belonging. So it transcends in many ways territory, and it transcends time. So it reflects that ability to access and utilize different, so here, much more operational definition, utilize different repertoires of cultural knowledge. So that could be values, could be practices, could be languages, could be anything, that you are selectively accessing. And cross-cultural capital is not just diffusing. This is really how it moves beyond the hybridity kind of literature. It's not just diffusing of the two identities, but it offers the possibilities of something new being created. So always, second-generation migrant youth, they like to think that they're more than just heritage culture and mainstream culture. There's something unique about them. It's that possibility of have the creative capacity to articulate something new. So it's knowledge and skills that youth access to develop and develop as potential assets for themselves, their communities and their societies in which they happen to live. But there's another important argument to make, which is the agentic capacity of transcultural capital. So why we're saying transcultural capital? It's because it is a positive tool that enables migrant youth to utilize selectively certain aspects of their various cultural repertoires or systems and utilize them in ways where they negotiate social empowerment, they negotiate access to labor market, they negotiate navigating problems of racism. So it is a very agentic capacity. So this is the different framing for a lot of migrant youth research that's been taking place previously, which of course focused on barriers, discriminations, kind of being subjected to policies in negative manner, passive manner. So here the project aims to move away from that dichotomy of assimilation integration by reframing the very notion of migrant from a social position of disempowerment and disadvantage to one that should be disadvantaged, to one of agency and active engagement, right? So that relates to challenges, etc. Now brings me to research questions. Sorry for that very long theoretical and contextual discussion, because I think that's really more important in many ways than I'll share with you the findings. We'll be very quick discussing the findings. So the questions were really that at the level of culture, how do migrant youth understand, negotiate, and deploy multiple interactive cultural systems? In what way that shapes processes of cultural identification? At the level of society, does transcultural capital affect social belonging and local attachment? In what ways, if any? And at the political level, do international political processes and manifestations of transcultural capital, at what level, that happens, and how do they impact or relate to the national identification of migrant youths locally? So basically, the questions relate to the cultural, the social, and the political manifestation of transcultural capital. This is really, don't have to spend time on this, how the project was delivered, 3 phases of data collection across 3 sites. And of course, it was mixed methods approach. There was a lot of field work, and there was an overarching survey in the 3 jurisdictions. In terms of numbers, 119 interviews across the 3 sites. So the sites are Melbourne, Toronto, and Birmingham in the UK, there's good diversity across age, as you can see, in terms of youth. So categorically, youth were first and second generation, but in terms of first generation, we looked at 3 periods of settlement. So 0 to 5, 6 to 10, and 11 and more, And of course, because time here is part of the hypothesis being tested. Religion, as you can see, very good kind of spread of religious backgrounds. There are some sites where a particular denomination was higher than in other sites, like Muslims in Birmingham was slightly higher than Muslim respondents in either Melbourne or in Toronto, but that is very probably explainable in many ways. And what are the key assumptions being tested? Very much what we've spoken about earlier, the interconnectivity, that there's articulations, the intersection, intergenerational dimensions of our identities. Now, I'm going to try to share with you some of the findings as fast as I can, and then we'll allow both Serena and Lori to add a few things, and then we open up for discussion, Because I thought that discussion on the theory and the context is really important, which then contextualizes what we're going to talk about here. So the first assumption is TC as accessing multiple cultures equal equals positive attitudes, orientations, and everyday experience, and also that TC, transcultural capital, equal agentic opportunities for actions across spatial temporal domains to overcome challenges. That was one of the common elements that we found in migrant youth. And I'll tell you at the conclusion why this is a very important finding. And here's some of the interviewees, of course, we're just using the acronyms here. Well, I think that I pick up things that tend to agree with me subconsciously through what I see other people do. So like through what I see my parents do or friends within those communities. And if you could say that I'm like an amalgamation of the people that I surround myself with, yeah? Again, transcultural capital reflecting that fluid hybrid negotiation of difference. Like I said, the best part about moving from one culture to another. Here, notice the awareness of actually crossing those cultural borders, yeah? From moving from one culture to another is that you get to pick and choose what parts you want to stick with, right? So here, that selective accessing of certain cultural elements and the weaving of those elements into something new. So, you know, keeping all the heritage and the stories, the language from there, but also to pick up a bit more of the relaxed, I guess, nature of Australian. So here I'm marrying elements of both societies, if you like. Again, the next one is, I think, with the younger generations, with our cultural identity, we're learning to have to be more bicultural. And these words they're using them, so we're not the interviewers telling them, bicultural. So bicultural as in, we have this culture, that culture, and being able to bring those two together to be able to have our own unique sense of cultural identity. And I would underline that. So bring this and that so that we can bring our own unique, create our own unique sense of cultural identity and confidence. More in terms of the networking side, this is kind of the local transnational cross-cultural networking. And then you can see there highlighted just some of the relevant sections. Luckily, my uncle is Australian. So at home, like we can speak English, but I can practice also this with him. So here, really talking about the linguistic, if you like, diversity within that particular family. Then yes, we've got a lot of friends here, and I make a lot of Australian friends too. I have Australian neighbors, and they like my grandma and granddad. I'm very attached to them because when the first day we came, I was a little bit scared, a little bit shy. So this is again the easing the process of social incorporation. We help each other when we need help. If we go somewhere, we forget our letterbox, he brings up. So talks about accessing those networks and what it does to their everyday life, if you like. That's just to give you a feel for the data, but I'm going to later on tell you why those particular, if you like, findings are very important, both empirically but also theoretically. So the survey, a large survey collected across the 3 sites, more than 1,220, was roughly 400 per country or just over. And then we did a lot of tests for crosstabs, call them crosstabs these days, yeah, to work out some of the key findings. Here, just to give you the breakdown of who we have, gender-wise, but also first gen as opposed to second gen. And you can see a nice, not always 50-50, but close to it in many cases, yeah. We can talk about conducting surveys online, but they're very challenging, not easy to do. But this is I'm going to share with you some of the findings of the survey in relation to 2 things. One is how having access to more than one culture makes us feel. And the other one is the extent to which we engage and sustain those transnational connections. So here you can see, if you just focus on, I guess it's the blue and the yellow, that's the strongly agree, and you can look across all the jurisdictions, there's always an overwhelming majority of positive reflections on what having access to more than one culture does to me. Makes me stronger, gives me a stronger sense of identity, or the second graph is framed negatively. You know, so with the surveys, and Santosh, you know very well, with the survey things, you need to frame positively and negatively so that if people are answering without reading, then you know that they're doing that. Here you can see when you frame the question negatively, then you get the disagree and strongly disagree higher bars there, yeah? So it shows you that people are actually, they mean what they're doing here, right? It's not just by ticking quickly the survey boxes. So that's a good positive association. Having access to more than one culture, again, allows me to understand other people's feelings and experiences and makes positive difference to my life. Again, the strongly agree, blue, and agree, the yellow, across all the jurisdictions is much, much higher. Sometimes you find the neutral, which is the orange, a little bit high, which you can spend some time trying to understand why. But overwhelmingly, the negative answers, that is disagree, strongly disagree, are very low in comparison, yeah? So that's what we want. Here, the frequency of contact with family, friends, or ethnic community overseas, this is really, really interesting stuff, and we spend a bit of time on it too. And you see never, if you like, or just a few times a year, as opposed to the at least once a week or every day. And if you just focus on the last two bars, at least once a week, every day, and you see them consistently between them. In Australia, that's 48, in Canada, that's again 47, and in the UK, about 52. So it's very high. So more than half, at least, engage in those transnational connections once a week or once a day. That is quite strong, yeah? And then if you look at it, contact with family, friends, or ethnic community overseas by generation, this is again quite interesting. So now we're comparing not only by sites, but sites and generations. And you can look at this, spend 30 seconds, look at this, and you will see automatically, or quickly anyway, that first gen do a lot more of that transnational practice than second gen. And that is understandable in many ways, because as time passes by, you become less reliant on transnational connections than if you are just here within 5 years or 10 years, yeah? So you still rely on many, but also the engagement could have certain features like economic dimensions, sending money. So first gen is always exhibiting much higher. So in Australia, it's almost 60%, 60 something. I'm putting the once a week, every day together. In Canada, that again, 60%, and in the UK, 62%. So across the three, for first gen is well above 60%. If you compare that with second gen, Australia is 37, Canada is 38, and the UK is just over 40 something, 45. So clearly there's a big difference there between a generational difference to that kind of engagement. So just moving quickly now. So what are the key findings and from the online survey? So belonging, as we saw with the qualitative data in particular, the similarities across the three sites, the neutral value sometimes a bit high, but probably needs a bit more work. Identity, family, friends, networks, keep self-identification much more than formal institutions. Online networking, very high across the three sites, and I could add there decreases across generations. Engagement, more civic as opposed to political across the three sites. And you can, I can show you the data there, but you have to take my word for it. So key findings, commonalities, we just spoke about them. I'll just highlight that the engagement and the drawing on multiple cultural repertoires, the sense that transcultural capitals exemplifies that people are not caught or lost between two or more cultures. They actually use that positively. The spatial dimension is critical importance to understanding and making the most of those opportunities. And the other element is that the frequent mention that migrant youth identities are, they sometimes, it's quite amazing. They explicitly mention that fluidity and the biculturality and the multifaceted nature of their identity. So people are aware of these things. Differences, they're not really significant, but we can reflect on some of the site-specific things. So Melbourne, Australia, rising level of super diversity. Of course, Australia is now officially a migrant majority society. This is the ABS Census 2021. We have 51.7% of Australians are born or have at least one parent who's born overseas. So that's overall positive appraisals of diversity and multiculturalism, yet there's concern around racism, intergenerational conflict, etc. Birmingham is more of a social cohesion integrative rather than multicultural policy, public policy there. That's slightly different from Canada, Australia. Multiculturalism is questioned publicly. And as early as the 2000s, we started talking about parallel lives. lack of integration, threat to national security, etc., etc. There is a bit of spatial segregation that takes place in parts of the UK, of course. Yet Birmingham was viewed positively, which is, Lori and I and Serena have been talking about this. So despite all of that, young people in Birmingham viewed these questions positively, so highlighting the contextualized spatial dimension of everyday multiculturalism. And Toronto, there's an official support for multiculturalism in Canada. It's actually the only jurisdiction that has a multicultural act, and it has constitutional recognition of multiculturalism too. Yet almost all participants have positive views of MC in Canada. Still significant practical challenges for recent arrivals, and certainly there is a degree of conflict tension. There is also a strong degree of accommodation and solidarity. We are seeing it. So, concluding remarks, which trying to reflect on the implications of these findings. So at the empirical level, the fundamental question in this project, or questions actually we had highlighted in this research, are that the way migrant youth tap into different forms of transcultural capital in order to negotiate cultural identity and social empowerments are extremely telling, if you like, and are telling at the policy level. They're telling because I think we tend to lose sight, and we should not lose sight at the policy level, of the need for broader, deeper change among dominant social institutions and structures. So we're still very much, in some jurisdictions, not having really done enough to reflect the super diversity that we are seeing socially and demographically in the way we set up structures and institutions, right? Whereupon diversity and difference can be reconceptualized as productive assets, not only for the individuals concerned, but also for the multiple interconnected communities within which they happen to exist. At a more normative conceptual level, I think what we've talked about earlier, migrant youth, through these multi-level engagement practices, in my view anyway, represent a bottom-up counter-narrative of agency and empathy against an otherwise homogenizing reductionist discourse around failing diversity policies and weakening social cohesion. This is really probably the gist of what I want to say. Like, if you say choose one particular finding, I would be this one. And finally, it is important to acknowledge also that the complexity of migrant youth relationships, identities, and belonging, we need to acknowledge this complexity without falling into the old binaries approach. Yeah? Yes, there is a degree of conflict strain, but often there is also a strong degree of creative accommodation and intergroup solidarity. This is not only visible in relationships with members of the white majority, but also in migrant youth intergenerational engagements with their local, transnational, and ethnocultural communities. So these are the four key takeaway messages, if you like, from this project, which I think I have not done service by trying to summarize it like this, but I hope I've given you a little bit of a feel for what the design is and what the key findings are and what kind of implications they might have. So I might stop there, Greg. Sure. And then we ask Serena and Lori perhaps to add or to respond. Then we open up for questions.
It's a lot to take in. It's a large set across three nations, three cities. It's nice and rich. Lori, Serena, did you want to add something we haven't covered, or particular things you wanted to explain, unpack a bit further?
Yeah, I mean, just a few things. Fethi, sure. I mean, you've done an amazing job of just covering this huge project in such a short time. And I'll just add a few things, and then Serena, turn to you, because we've been having conversation. The luxury of this is that being face-to-face, we've been able to have some really good conversation. As you might imagine, when I'm not in this space, I'm engaged in other projects. And my current project is on non-religion in a complex future. And so I'm interested in the broader project that we share, which is how to live well together. So this is always my question as I'm thinking about the results here. A couple of things I just wanted to flag. So the statistics show, and Fethi has concluded, that we're fairly similar in terms of our context. But one of the things that I think we're interested in doing is drilling down a little bit deeper into the interview data, because we're seeing some kind of nuanced distinctions, especially when we, Canada and Australia seem to be fairly similar, but we seem to see something that's a little bit distinct in Birmingham in terms of the ways that these young people are presenting themselves and navigating and negotiating. And if I had to summarize it, and this is a little bit impressionistic, I would say there's still a stronger sense of us and them in the British context, which is kind of surprising. And I feel like I'm a multicultural advocate this week, and I'm not usually finding myself so uncritical of multiculturalism, but I think being in two contexts which are actively supporting multiculturalism, I'm asking questions about what is the impact of that? And we're seeing it, I think, in the interview data where we see people actively mobilizing multiculturalism. So in the Canadian interviews, for example, we see 50% of people spontaneously raising multiculturalism as a tool they mobilize. And very much, disassembling the binary. There's no, I don't want to overstate it. The us, them is disappearing. And it's very much a sense of, we are part of this, we belong, and we live in a multicultural society. We are part of that society, and we're going to push that to make it work for us. So that's an impressionistic, I'm fairly familiar with the Canadian interviews, and I'm moving through the Australian interviews and the British interviews, but what strikes me is the similarity in many ways between the Australian and the British interviews. Even though Canada has a much stronger legal framework for multiculturalism, not necessarily a stronger social network and civil society support, but we do have multiculturalism integrated into our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have a Multiculturalism Act. These are federal bits, so they cover the whole nation. And that may make a difference, but I don't think we'll ever be able to say causation, cite causation or note that it's causal. It will only ever be something that's a correlation, so it's always going to be a little bit speculative, but I intend to push that because I think there's something there. When people see and are able to frame their national imaginary in terms of a multicultural space where everyone belongs, you lose that sense of the binary of the mainstream. They are the mainstream. And I think that's really encouraging. And we see some of that in the Australian interviews as well. I also work a bit on equality. And so I'm thinking about equality, and these small anecdotes are really, really important. Like, we love our neighbors, we do things for each other, and I call them non-events in some of my other research. There's sort of, and I use this phrase, deep equality. They're deep equality moments. They seem to be relatively superficial, but they're the ways in which people are integrated and feeling belonging as part of a whole. And so I'm not sure we have fully abandoned that sort of community common culture. The common culture is being reformulated. And it is something new, Fethi. I think you're absolutely right to identify that. So I really like the way that you're framing that, we're framing that. Obviously, Fethi has been leading this project, and so he's theoretically and intellectually more invested, I think, than I've been able to be, but I've been so pleased to be part of it. I think I'm just going to leave it there because I really want us to be able to talk together.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. Thank you so much, Fethi. I had lots of thoughts as you were both speaking, so excuse me because my thoughts are sort of a little bit jumbled. As I was listening to Fethi, I was reminded of a couple of things. So I think in the UK, we've kind of had these shifts, and certainly we had a long phase of multiculturalism, and it was criticised even then as being about samosas, steel bands and saris, and that it was very superficial and didn't really mean anything. But I think that's unfair. I think it clearly did mean something. We had a watershed moment in the early 2000s because we had, after a very, very, very long time, what were perceived to be racial disturbances. So we had what were kind of framed as race riots in northern towns. And what was really distinct about this version of the race riots is it was a demographic who were seen to be behaviours and non-problematic. And all of a sudden they were now the new deviant group. And these were young Muslim men who up until this point had sort of just, kept their heads down and got on with it, and their fathers had worked in factories and become taxi drivers, and all they cared about were buying property and going back home and whatever. So the narrative had really changed, and this is against the backdrop of sort of global events, 9/11, and so I think part of that policy shift and moving away from multiculturalism was the fact that we now had this new deviant population, and we, meaning policy makers, were really desperately trying to provide a framework to understand what this new perceived problem was. So it's not that multiculturalism didn't exist. It did. It just sort of then was forced to be replaced, I suppose, and sort of put under a microscope. But at that time, even when sort of within that sort of multicultural period, if you like, there was still this perceived sense that ethnic minority communities in the UK, especially young people, second generation, were trapped between two cultures. And that was problematic. That these were competing cultures, that these were often limiting for them. And I, however, as an undergraduate, had a professor, the late Roger Ballard, who was probably the first person who ever spoke about the fact that he thought that this was complete nonsense. And he essentially said what Fethi is saying today, so he didn't really talk about it in terms of accessing and utilizing, but this is exactly what he meant. He said that actually young people are really skilled at knowing the right behaviors. They know how to behave in these different spaces. So when they're with their extended families, they know exactly how to sit and behave and perform, and they know exactly what to do in schools and in the supermarket. So he was the first person that I ever heard talk about it in this way. Yeah, exactly. Since then, we had, since the kind of this shift then, the whole Cantle, community cohesion, we had social scientists, and this probably happened in a lot of places, but certainly in Europe and in the UK, who then started to try to sort of measure identity and looked at identity salience. So are young people more likely to identify as Muslim or Pakistani or British? So even though we were getting the hyphenated dual identities, that wasn't enough. People were really interested in how strongly did people identify with certain identity items, and could that tell us something about certain outcomes? And I think we haven't done that with the survey data, but I think that would be quite interesting to do. And another thing to say perhaps about the British context is that although we're talking about first generation and second generation in terms of our sample, that's not strictly true in the UK. That age group in terms of British born are more likely to be third generation. So even the fact that we're seeing that they still maintain contact with family and friends overseas, really, I think to me was quite incredible. That hasn't stopped. We still have that level of, attachment, if you like. And I would sort of go one further. I know Fethi started his presentation talking about hypermobile and ICT, and not everybody has access to flights and travel. I know we're all very privileged here, but I think in reality, most young people living in Birmingham may not be able to sort of travel as much as we do. What they do all have access to that their parents didn't have access to, of course, is social media. And we've seen just how impactful this is now in terms of it really influencing the way they behave about their identity and their heritage. So recently, many of you will be familiar that we had disturbances in Leicester. There was a sort of a Hindutva mobilization of people who weren't from Leicester, actually. I mean, a lot of these young people were bussed into Leicester. They weren't local people. What was really key about that is Leicester is home to Gujarati Muslim and Hindu communities. And a Gujarati Muslim resident of Leicester pointed out to me, I thought this was really something that was very important to acknowledge, is that when they were having the disturbances in Gujarat, the Hindu-Muslim clashes in Gujarat, that did not translate onto the streets of Leicester. There were no disturbances in Leicester at that time. So it's not that transnational link wasn't there. It was there. Of course, there were quite tensions between the communities, but we didn't see these clashes that we're seeing now. And I think that we're sort of entering into a phase that, be it second, third, or subsequent generation, having access, instant access to what's happening in the site of heritage or origin can really have an influence on people's political beliefs or beliefs about how they should be behaving if they are authentically an X, Y, or a Z. So I know within the theory, we haven't really talked about it, but this sort of idea of the glocal, I think we're really seeing that play out in the UK, and I'm sure we see it here as well. But I think that's just another dimension of how people within Britain, Australia, and Canada will have that sort of, even though it's a virtual space, it's a space nevertheless that they're also now having to negotiate. So not just the physical spaces of where we are at any given time, but that sort of online space that is having so much influence on us as well. So I guess that's really all I had to say in addition to what you've both said. But yeah, and the performing citizenship, I just had a bit of a little bit of a controversial thought about that. I mean, again, in a British context, we had a lot of that with the whole British values that, you know, you've got to adopt these British values, but the pushback was, well, what does that even mean? And when we unpicked that, it was certainly performing citizenship, you know, being good to your neighbour, collecting the mail, putting out the rubbish, you know, all of that kind of thing. And one last point, because I think it's prudent to what Lori said. Certainly, yes, we have these different sort of policy backdrops in the three contexts, but we really do have quite distinct historical, you know, context in terms of the UK. So you're right, Australia, Melbourne, Australia, Canada, migrant countries, let's face it, the UK, very different. And there's an artist, a Birmingham-born artist called Professor Hussain, who said this beautifully. He kind of creates these neon shop signs. And one of them very famously said, "We are here because you were there." And I think in the UK, this is the difference.
Yes.
I think perhaps there's a confidence in us being able to say we're not happy about things because we have a very long historical relationship with our host country. I mean, my grandfather worked for the British Naval, forces before we even thought about, he didn't even physically migrate here, it was his daughter, but there's been a relationship that's been going on for a while. I think there's also that confidence that we can see in the fact that we have an Indian heritage Prime Minister, we have a Pakistani heritage First Minister of Scotland, we have a Pakistani heritage Mayor of London, so perhaps that also means that we can be a bit more vocal about it. So again, I think the survey data would be interesting in terms of sort of modelling some of those variables to see what that relationship really looks like. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Oh, wonderful. So much to unpack. Yeah, because the seat of colonial empire, there's a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I really want to ask you about your views on Citizen Khan, but we can come back to that. Were any questions online?
Yes.
Yes.
And John's just raised his
Oh, great.
hand.
And he's
We beat you to it, sorry, Hassan.
It's okay. Go ahead, John.
And Josh as well.
And Josh. And you got Union Jack in the background. It's very good, John.
Go for it, John. Come on. Are you on mute or is he on mute?
Australian flag.
Okay. Matching shirt too, John. That's very good.
He's on mute.
I've unmuted. This was my flag given to me when I attained Australian citizenship, so it does have a certain amount of affective capital to it for me. Look, really, really interesting presentations. Seems to me that the conceptual and the empirical discussion together raises a serious challenge to the notion of the diaspora. Now, if we're going to get rid of the term, is it past its use by date? If it is, that will be quite an interesting thing to tell the folks outside in the world, in Australian society, some of whom are more attached to that concept in an affective identity way than others. But what does diaspora mean, if anything, given both the conceptual and the empirical outcomes from today.
Excellent.
Take a few questions.
Let's take a few questions together.
Okay,
I think
go
we
right.
can- Yes.
Yes, I remember.
So I think you were next, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating presentation, and just adds to the pretty exceptional work that's been done by these scholars, but more internationally as well. But my question is, I suppose, the flip end of all this, which looks at the positive contributions and I suppose the resilience, but the ways that migrant communities over time have built like a really positive conception of citizenship and contribution to society, often in the face of strong securitisation and many other challenges, including racism. And yet, if we look at contemporary challenges facing multicultural societies, in particular conflicts between groups based on, say, international conflict, so we're talking Khalistan workers movement, or the Khalistan movement, whatever they're called, sorry, and the intra-Indian diaspora, sorry, John, challenges there. We've seen conflicts at Flinders Street Steps with members of our Indian communities, talking about, for example, the Jewish and Muslim communities in Melbourne and the challenges that are being faced there. And I suppose there's this paradox whereby, even though they have less to do, as your figures indicate, they have less to do in terms of discussion with overseas-based members of their family. They're less likely to engage directly with them. They've adopted a much more hardened identity in relation to those conflicts. Ghassan Haj talks about militarization and some other ways to explain that, but I'm wondering, based on your unique research, what insights you could offer into that hardening of identity amongst the second and third generation, despite all the positive work being done there too.
Maybe.
Yes, well, Josh.
Santosh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'll try to be as short as possible, though I have a lot to say. Great presentation. I really enjoyed something that fits within the work that I do. But I'm very interested in the processes or the pathways for an outcome. So my work is on migrant health, how it changes over time compared to the native born. Similar to and cultural identity is one of the pathways through things change, whether they retain the health habits of back home or they change here. So to me, the cultural identity or cultural awareness is a self-awareness process. I call it a process, and that's how I get to my question. That is achieved through their collective experience of the membership or their individual perception as they compare themselves to a reference group. And they go through this process of self-discovery and self-identity and their culture, ethnic roots with their experience and their experiences of racism in the country. So what I'm interested is in knowing that, and also on my experience, like going to UK, I was on a fellowship and then talking to the natives. In America, they use ABC, American born, confused first and second generation, particularly migrants. That have you looked at, and you said about looking at the data, or have you asked questions and then analyzed about the process that how do they see from whether whether the process remain unexplored or they became aware of my multicultural or bicultural and they accept. So from unexplored to acceptance, that how did they arrive to the present one, and what difference does it make between the British and the Canadian and the Australian thing? And what Serena said, that in British, because they had stayed long, and I talked to various people, being a migrant, they consider, particularly third generation, they don't accept racism. They say we have the equal rights. We are here, like they know, they're aware of the things compared to the first one. The first generation may be aware, but they don't pinpoint it. They accept it, but the third generation not going to accept. So all these things involved in the processes of coming from A to B to C. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I will take your question to just, because I think we're going to be out of time when it comes to the answers, so let's have your question and see if we...
It is actually a comment and maybe I'm not sure. On Serena's last point about the third generation or the youngest generation having transnational connections thanks to digital technologies. I've been interviewing Turks here and 3 different generations. So first generation were around 70 years old, and the second 50-ish, and then their children were in their early 20s. What I observed was that the first generation and third generations are very much Turkey focused. Second generation, they see themselves as Aussies. So they are all studying Turks, but they are not really interested much about Turkish politics. But the third generation, strangely, they are very active in Turkish politics. They don't even watch ABC or SBS. They say it's boring. We watch Turkish TV, etc. Whereas for the second generation, they watch SBS and ABC all the time. So I was thinking that this is thanks to digital technologies, but also I am thinking that it may be also due to governments, these transnational activities reaching out to diasporas. Indians BJP has been doing it a lot, and Turkey has been doing it a lot. Maybe this can be another factor, and I wonder if you have seen similar things. You may maybe look at your interview data to see if there are. I know that you did an interview first, I mean, people at 70 years old, but sometimes the kids talk about their grandparents, or they were not active, or my parent is very active or not active. So still you could get some data about their parents and first and second generations.
I think so. That's good. They're really good questions. We normally run this just for an hour through to the top of the hour, but I mean, people, if they have to go on other meetings, that's fine. Some left already, but if we go around, we'll go a little bit longer, that's okay, for those who can stay, and we'll ask each participant to respond to points they wish to pick up.
Okay, I'll be very quick actually, because I think it's there's a lot to, we need another session to,
we do.
But just to go very quickly, I'm going to be like a classroom teacher here. What I mean by this, be short here. So start with a comment that Serena made about performative citizenship. It's not about doing those daily things. Actually, it indicates a struggle towards justice and equality. And if you want to define it operationally, it's the right to claim rights. They can put it like that. So we don't wait passively. Speaking up, yes. Yeah. So we don't wait for things to be handed to you. As I said earlier, rights and duties. It's actually your right to claim your rights and to voice that publicly. So, what I mean by performing your citizenship, yeah? It's not doing the little things in the neighborhood. Diaspora, John, this is why I don't use the term. I don't actually use the term. I differentiate between diaspora and transnational community. They're not the same thing. This research is about transnational communities living lives transnationally. It's not about diaspora communities. You want me the difference? I can tell you the difference theoretically. Diaspora has always implied that one, there is dispersal with the view of going back home, and in that process, maintaining ties with the homeland. So you get Palestinian diaspora, Jewish diaspora, whatever, Kurdish diaspora. There is always that yearning to go back home. Transnational communities don't have that. They migrate, they maintain some ties, but there is no yearning to go back home, yeah? So we need to be, and which is why I don't use diaspora except for one project, I use diaspora. That's my second answer. I think Josh's question is very important, and actually trying to do a new IRC on that particular question, Josh, in relation to the impact international conflicts on local communities and social cohesion in general, yeah? And that's another discussion. I cannot answer it specifically right now, but I think it has that area of exploration. It is beginning to open up, and we really need to think very carefully what is motivating some of those divisions within our societies. Why is it that some people choose to identify strongly with heritage or with ethno-cultural identity, homeland politics, whatever, at times of crisis? it is extremely problematic, and we need to think about it much more carefully. And I think I can stop there. Maybe my colleagues will answer the question about process towards acceptance, which I think Santosh raised, and third generation, interesting, but I'm happy not to take all the questions.
I think that's a really important observation about the third generation. I think you're right. And there's a project that a colleague of mine in Lahore, based in Lahore, has been doing that's looking at this in terms of the Indian sort of campaign to reach out to diaspora Jews.
We do use it now.
But also we've had a similar campaign with the whole Imran Khan being imprisoned in Pakistan in the diaspora, because the diaspora was a safer space. You couldn't openly campaign using the PTI political, label in Pakistan. So yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. And I think part of it is the fact that, and certainly we see this in the UK, that third subsequent generations have a desire to learn more about their heritage and to connect more. As I said, not everybody has the access to travel. Certainly in the UK, we have whole communities who migrated, whole villages, towns, neighborhoods who migrated and don't have many family members left. So the only way that they would access that space is through social media. So I think that's a really interesting observation. Thank you.
I have nothing to say about process, Fethi. That's your question. So you're gonna have to take that on. No, I think you have to accept this. Sometimes I'm sorry. I think Fethi has an obligation to answer you.
We'll talk about
I think he has an obligation to answer you. I want to take Fethi on something else too, because he made this little dismissive comment. I'm going to take him on it. He said, garbage and mail has nothing to do with knowing your rights. I disagree. I'm a jurist and I'm also a sociologist. And I think if people feel comfortable where they are and like they belong, they feel better able to access and to understand that they have rights. So Fethi, we're going to have to talk about that. Josh, I think your question is really important, but one of the things we're trying to do is simply turn the focus to positive narratives, if you will. What are the things that people mobilize? What are the ways they mobilize? We need, and I know your focus is otherwise, and I appreciate your work immensely, but I think we also need this other work that does the work that we've just done, which is what are the tools that people have and how do they mobilize them? So it is an entirely other conversation, and yours in tandem with ours are, I think, two very important pieces. But I think we want to turn the focus just now to these cultural tools, if you will, for lack of a better word. I'm not being super articulate. And then the last piece is on grandparents. Grandparents are so influential. So I think it might be interesting to track the conversations between grandparents and the grandchildren. Yeah. Because oftentimes ideologically, young people will be more influenced by their grandparents than their parents. They resist their parents. So their grandparents are embracing something that, I don't know, worth exploring. That's it.
Can't let you go without clarifying. I'm not saying local things are important. All I'm saying, performative acts of citizenship theoretically is about rights to claim rights. So it's a macro level kind of struggle towards justice and equality. Everything else you do in the neighborhood, that's very important. No one is dismissive of that. Certainly not me, but it's a different level of citizenship articulation. It's not. I mean, there's a whole scholarship on contributory citizenship as opposed to performative citizenship, and it's all of. We go back to the whole debate in the recognition literature, Nancy Fraser and Mary Alice Young.
Recognition.
Sorry?
Redistribution.
Exactly. So redistribution, recognition, representation. So it's not, I think you.
I have a really quick follow-up on what Lori said, just in response to Josh's question. I actually don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think you can have high sort of salience in terms of an identity, but then still be incredibly skilled at negotiating and being in certain spaces. And I think that is actually the key thing, that people still are able to hold these identities, but because of the fact that they are in these societies and they have no choice but to engage with other communities, they still are able to do that. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive or necessarily problematic.
Look at the First Minister of Scotland.
Exactly.
Well, there's so much more we could go on with, and if we could, we'd come back to another hour. But you guys are going to be moving on, unfortunately. But we'll pick up this topic at some other point through the year, I think. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.